In 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan recorded something strange in the final moments of dying rats: a massive, coordinated surge of brain activity, stronger than anything seen while the animals were fully awake. It happened seconds after the heart stopped, when the brain should have been shutting down. Instead, it lit up. That surge became one of the starting points for a growing body of research into what actually happens inside the brain during the dying process. And it turns out, the brain doesn't simply flicker off like a light switch. In several studies on humans with terminal brain injuries who had life support withdrawn, researchers recorded a similar spike in gamma wave activity, the same type of brainwave associated with high-level thinking, memory recall, and consciousness occurring in the moments right around when the heart stopped. One widely discussed case, published in 2022, involved an 7-year-old patient who was already being monitored with EEG for epilepsy when he suffered a fatal heart attack. Because the equipment happened to be recording, researchers captured roughly 900 seconds of brain activity spanning the moments before and after his heart stopped, an almost accidental window into a process no one had been able to observe this precisely before. In the 30 seconds before and after cardiac arrest, his brain showed a surge in gamma oscillations, specifically in regions associated with memory retrieval and dreaming. It was, as far as researchers could tell, the first time this kind of data had ever been captured directly from a dying human brain, rather than inferred from animal studies or after-the-fact patient interviews. Researchers who study this phenomenon have proposed a specific explanation. As blood flow and oxygen drop, the brain may lose some of the inhibitory signals that normally keep neural activity contained and organized. Under ordinary conditions, the brain relies heavily on inhibitory neurons to prevent regions from firing in an uncontrolled, runaway way, a kind of built-in braking system. Without those brakes, regions of the brain that don't usually fire together can suddenly synchronize, producing a brief, intense burst of coordinated activity, not the brain shutting down, but briefly firing in a pattern unlike anything seen during ordinary waking life. This lines up with something researchers have noted for decades in survivors of cardiac arrest. In multiple studies interviewing people who were resuscitated after clinical death, meaning their heart had stopped and brain activity was assumed to have ceased, a notable percentage reported vivid, structured experiences during the period when they were, by clinical measures, unconscious. Life review sensations, a feeling of clarity, vivid recall of memories, all reported by people whose brains were believed to be offline at the time. Some described the sensation of time slowing down dramatically, or of memories replaying with unusual vividness and speed, compressed into what felt like a much longer span than the seconds or minutes that had actually passed. For a long time, this was difficult to explain, because the assumption was that once blood flow stops, the brain simply doesn't have the resources to produce organized experience. Standard models treated unconsciousness after cardiac arrest as essentially equivalent to the brain being offline, no meaningful electrical activity, and therefore no plausible way to generate a structured experience of any kind. But the more recent EEG data complicates that picture considerably. If a final surge of coordinated gamma activity really is happening in the dying brain, it offers a possible biological explanation for why some people report vivid, memory-like experiences right at the edge of clinical death, not necessarily evidence of anything beyond the physical brain, but a sign that the dying brain may be far more electrically active, at least briefly, than researchers originally assumed. There's an evolutionary angle some researchers have raised as well. The regions most associated with this final surge areas involved in memory and internal narrative are metabolically expensive to run and normally require a steady, well-regulated supply of oxygen and glucose. Their sudden, unregulated activation during oxygen deprivation isn't necessarily purposeful. Some researchers describe it more as a kind of electrical last gasp cells firing uncontrolled, as the systems that normally regulate them fail, rather than a deliberate final process the brain is running. In other words, the brain isn't choosing to replay a lifetime of memories on the way out. It's more likely that the specific circuits responsible for memory and narrative simply happen to be among the first to destabilize once their normal oxygen supply collapses, producing a burst of activity that feels, from the inside, like something meaningful. Not every recorded case shows this same surge, and researchers are careful to note that findings from a small number of patients, often with pre-existing brain injuries, may not generalize to how every human brain behaves in its final moments. The conditions under which someone dies, whether from cardiac arrest, prolonged illness, or traumatic injury, likely change what, if anything, the brain does in that window. A brain that fails suddenly from a heart attack may behave very differently from one that shuts down gradually over hours or days from illness. And researchers are still working out how much these differences matter. There's also ongoing debate about how to interpret animal studies in this context. Rats can't report subjective experience. So, while the coordinated gamma surge observed in dying rodents is a striking physiological finding, it doesn't tell researchers anything directly about whether that activity is accompanied by any kind of felt experience. The human EEG cases, rare as they are, remain the closest researchers have come to connecting this specific type of brain activity with the kinds of experiences survivors have described after resuscitation, though even there, the sample size remains far too small for firm conclusions. Still, the pattern has shown up often enough, across enough different research groups and species, that many neuroscientists now take seriously the idea that dying is not simply an off switch. It may be closer to a final, disorganized surge of the same electrical processes that produced every waking moment of a person's life, a system briefly overloading before it goes dark for good, rather than gently powering down the way a device does when its battery runs out. What do you think your brain would replay in its final seconds? If this made you think about it, hit subscribe. There are plenty more strange questions waiting for answers.